Hey guys. Hey, did you watch the movie Groundhog Day? If you haven't watched that until this point in time, then during COVID you must watch it because COVID feels so much like Groundhog Day. My goodness, it feels like I don't know, the same day looping over and over and over again in many ways. There's only a few things that kind of keep me aware that time is passing. One of them is I see my coffee beans getting smaller every day, like getting lower, and the other is I come here and connect with you guys, and I always think about where we are in the textbook and where we're going to. So you guys have become my clock of a sort, or my calendar, in a way. So cool. Let's get at it. Ooh, here we are, lecture 6B. Okay, so this chapter is entitled Structuralism versus Functionalism, and in that last lecture, I tried to give you a really solid idea of what was meant by structuralism, and of course I said functionalism is a little harder to nail down because it's almost just an opposition to structuralism. It's almost like, hey, you know what he said structuralism is? We're everything else, sort of. And so it was a very open approach, and it involved one of the things that are really going to tie together these next couple lectures, I guess, is one of the things it involved was a notion of applying psychology. So whereas Titchener, with his structuralism, thought everything had to be done experimentally in the lab under very tight procedures, so it was a very, very experimental thing that would only ever happen in the university kind of context. Exponents of functionalism were much more big thinking. So they were very open to the procedures and methods that they used, but they were also very open to issues like, well, how can psychology enhance life? How can we actually apply the science of psychology to the life around us? And so what I've decided to do with the rest of this chapter is divide it into 3 shorter lectures. This one might be a little long, but the next 2 will be very short, where they're just little areas. So this one we're going to focus on intelligence research. I'll then go on and very quickly talk about some of the applications of psychology in a business context. So we'll see how some psychologists started saying, hey, we can help businesses, or we can become businesses in a sense. And then finally, we're going to talk about comparative psychology, that notion of starting to learn about ourselves by doing research on animals. And so again, nothing Titchener would have ever ascribed to. But the functionalists thought that was perfectly reasonable. And of course, that does lay the stage for behaviorism, which is yet to come, where animals feature prominently. So that's the idea. Intelligence, business, comparative psychology. We're going to hit those ones. This one will be a little longer, perhaps the next 2 shorter. Okay, so intelligence it is. Boof, intelligence. This is a cool little subpart of the chapter because it's where psychology gets political. And it's about this sort of topic. Now, you won't see this mentioned in the textbook, or at least I have not seen it mentioned. I've seen it alluded to, but not talked to specifically. So the notion of speed of information processing. That is, that one's intelligence may be a reflection of one's machinery. We've talked about how Descartes said, we have this biological machinery and then a soul that interacts with it. Well, some of these early intelligence researchers and some that continue today are going to believe that our intelligence is a functioning of our biological machinery, and that some of us have better machinery that allows information to be processed more quickly, or allows a more complex amount of information to be considered at once. And that's what makes somebody intelligent, is they're able to figure things out quickly, or they're able to figure out more complex things out. And this will be one notion, that it's an innate thing, that it's tied to our biology. And why does that become contentious? Well, because some people started saying things like, oh, okay, so men and women have different biology. So maybe they have a different intelligence. Maybe one's more intelligent than the other. Different racial groups have different sort of biological backgrounds, different sort of evolutionary paths. Are certain races more intelligent than another? I hope you see immediately how these questions could be very contentious. In fact, I had one introductory psychology professor, my PhD supervisor, Philip Maracle, who argued that there are some topics that psychology perhaps should not even investigate. And this was one of his examples. If we found out that women were smarter than men, do we really want to know that? Because if that's official and if we have the scientific evidence for it, well, then who do we want to elect as leaders of our government? And, the basic idea is it's going to affect things like hiring policy, because you want to hire the best people. And if you want the most intelligent people, and women are more intelligent than men, then you're going to be biased to hire women, which is going to make a bunch of men upset. I'm not even going to talk about the potential racial differences. Well, I will. I'll come to it. But you get the idea. And so this study of intelligence has been political from the get-go. And I want to talk about that a little bit as we go through. You only get a taste of it in the textbook. I'm going to amplify that a little bit more. So it really starts with Galton, who we've already talked about before. And so Galton, remember, was in the business of setting up that tent in the fair and measuring everything there is about people. I said things like measuring arm length and measuring the size of your head and things like that. But he also had people do these various tests. I'll be more clear about that in the next slide. And these tests were meant to measure their speed of information processing. And for Galton, this was an early indication of their potential for success in life, their potential for eminence. That's how Galton talked about it. Okay, so the first character we meet in this chapter, no, not in this chapter, but in the intelligence part of this chapter, is James McKeen Cattell. And James McKeen Cattell is very much in the mold of Galton. He studied with Wundt as well, but then he did some time in England, and he learned a lot about Galton and Galton's work, and became very interested in it, and really kind of took off with it, but more in the spirit of intelligence rather than, Galton was always talking about eminence and eminence running in families. But remember that about Galton, right? He was very much about biology, about inheritance of certain things, and he was also the guy we associate with the eugenics movement. The notion that, certain people may have better traits, and those are the people we would like to breed. If somebody, for example, has a low intelligence, i.e., their information processing is slow, they are a suboptimal biological specimen, then we would rather they don't breed. Because we would rather weed out the suboptimal biological specimens. And it sounds so horrible when you say it that way, but that is exactly what the eugenics movement was about. So Cattell, he does not embrace eugenics, or at least not explicitly, but very much he's going to be the first one to kind of explicitly come at the topic of intelligence, and he does so from a very much Galton perspective. And so, there's the same idea. We are wired with all these neurons. And just like, we saw computers with better and better processing chips or more and more RAM are able to do, fancier things faster, that's the kind of mentality that some of these people had. So when they wanted to get at your intelligence, they did it in what seems like sort of odd ways to us now. But they literally looked at things like this. How hard could you squeeze? I guess that says something about your biological machinery, but that's more muscle, right? So I don't know about that. But how quickly can the hand be moved a distance of 50 centimeters? How quick can you do that? The idea is that's, involving neural commands to move these muscles around. And so somebody with better wiring might be able to do it more quickly. How far apart on the skin must two stimuli be in order to detect there's two and not one? This is something you can do with yourself for fun. If you get yourself something like this, two pens. Let me push that one out. Two pens. I'm going to have ink marks on my arm for doing this. But you can put the points so that they're very close together, and you can touch them, and if they're very close together, it feels like one touch. But if you move them apart enough, eventually you'll find a distance where it feels like two distinct sensations and not one. And so he would do this, but he would ask, he found that some people, a very short distance, they could detect two, whereas others needed a lot longer. And again, the idea was this is sensory tissue. How sensitive is it? How that biological machinery that senses the input, how fine of a distinction can it pick up, right? And people that could have a finer distinction, a smaller distance, they sensed it was two, maybe they have better machinery, maybe they're more intelligent. And so you see just examples of this. You see things like just noticeable differences, which should immediately make you think who? Fechner or Weber. Well, we didn't really talk about Weber here so much. You see reaction time things, etc. So all of these things just trying to get at how good your biological machinery is. And the argument being those with better machinery are more intelligent. Okay, so that was the sort of beginning of the measurement of intelligence. But it really kind of took off thanks to, of course, the work of Binet. So, Binet, you get the whole story in the textbook. He was asked to be part of this commission, and so it was very much a sort of governmental initiative where they were trying to enhance education. And they, one of the problems of education is we take students of varying abilities and varying backgrounds and varying, pre-learning, how much they've learned before they come to our class, and we try to put them through the same learning experience. And what they found in France at the time, or what they were finding, is that there were some students, and we know this, that were bored in every class. They were capable of moving a lot quicker than the rest of the class. And then there were other students who were, really falling behind and couldn't keep up. And so the question started to be, well, could we sort these students ahead of time? Could we figure out what the intellectual potential of a given student is? And maybe some of them will need some sort of special education, a little extra help. And you guys know now there's things like gifted programs. They didn't really have gifted programs here, so they weren't really looking for the high performers. But the fact that we have gifted programs now, and we also have sort of special needs programs, tells you that this business is still here today. And it was really started here in France. And so Binet was one of the people asked to join this commission. And of course, the first task was trying to come up with some way of detecting what the intellectual potential of a student was before they were a student, even, while they were a child. So that's the task Binet went about trying to solve along with Simon. So the two of them together, Binet and Simon, produced the first real intelligence test, So Cattell and stuff were kind of getting around it with their speed of information processing idea, but Binet was much more about what are you able to do intellectually, sort of cognitively. So he was getting there. So first of all, their first step was to define intelligence, and it's kind of interesting to see what maybe perhaps the first formal definition of intelligence. It's still a slippery concept today, but in Binet's words, it is a fundamental faculty, the alteration or lack of which is of the utmost importance for practical life. The faculty is judgment, otherwise called good sense, practical sense, initiative, the faculty of adapting oneself to circumstances. To judge well, to comprehend well, to reason well, these are the essential activities of intelligence. So, it's one of these things we throw around, those words we throw around, somebody's more intelligent than another. But one of the things you'll find out as we learn more about intelligence research is it gets really tricky to nail down exactly what we mean when we say one person is more intelligent than another. And maybe we actually mean a number of things. Maybe there's a bunch of different things that go into somebody's intelligence. And you kind of see that already here. Everywhere from good practical sense to initiative. That seems different than common sense. Adapting oneself to circumstances. That's what we often hear that consciousness is about. Judging, comprehending. So just think of those two, judging versus comprehending. Comprehending is very much like you're getting information and are you understanding what you're receiving, which is very different from judging, right? Reasoning. And so we're seeing actually a conglomeration of different abilities here right from the outset connected with this concept of intelligence, and that makes it a little tricky. But of course, he tried to be a lot more objective by actually creating a test to measure this and to quantify it in a given person. So that's a pretty big task to take on. I'm going to find a way to measure people's intelligence. So he did, and he came up with all these various different questions and approaches that could be anything from a sort of mathematics question to whatever. And we've got a sense here. His notion was to find questions that your typical children of a certain age could or could not answer. So just to walk you through this. So give the family name. What is your family name? So the idea here is younger than 3, most children don't know that. They may know their name. I am Ashley, or I am whatever I am, but they don't know their family name until about 3 years old. About 3 years old, they learn their family name, and the typical 3-year-old can tell you that. The typical 3-year-old or older, right? So anybody else could tell you that as well. But let's go to the 4-year-old, and then this will make it better. So with a 4-year-old, you can tell them 3 numbers, and you can say, okay, hang on for a sec. Now tell me back, what were those 3 numbers? And they can do that. So an average 4-year-old can do that. An average 3-year-old cannot do that yet. Okay, etc. 5-year-old compare 2 weights and tell you which one's heavier. Apparently 4-year-olds can't do that yet, but 5-year-olds can. This one seemed kind of funny to me. 6-year-olds, by 6-year-olds, they can distinguish morning and afternoon. I guess that's a subtle thing. Right now, is it the morning or is it the afternoon? I guess I assumed kids could figure that out at a younger age. According to Binet, not. And you have a selection of things here. Criticize absurd statements. Describe abstract words. Let me give you a taste of that. That's like a word justice or love. Describe it. Everyone can describe pickup truck, but justice is a little harder to describe. And so they would give them abstract words like that. And you see this list. So what he was doing was basically saying, okay, if we can get a sense of what your typical child can do at given ages, then we can take a specific child and we can ask them these questions. And we can get a sense of where they're at. So for example, let's say we have a 9-year-old that cannot name the months of the year in order yet, even though your average 9-year-old can. And they cannot give a day and date, and they cannot describe a picture, or maybe they kind of can describe a picture. Maybe they can certainly distinguish morning from afternoon. So what we might say is this 9-year-old, it's kind of behaving at the level of a 6-year-old. And so it provides a very clear way to talk about somebody. There might be another 9-year-old, in fact, that can name the months of years and can criticize absurd statements and can describe abstract words. So that 9-year-old may be functioning at the level of a 12-year-old. And so this during Binet's time was the way of describing things, and that was his approach to kind of getting at that. He had a great mustache too, didn't he? Huh? I wish I could grow a mustache like that. No, I don't. Okay, the Terman twist. So I want to bring in Terman here as somebody who's kind of turned the intelligence test into something we know a little bit more. So his name was Lewis Terman. He was very interested in Binet's work and got to know it really well. And he came up with this little twist. He did 2 things I'm going to highlight, but let's do the twist first. So the twist is Binet would somewhat awkwardly be saying things like that 9-year-old behaves at the level of a 12-year-old or functions at the level of a 12-year-old, which isn't horrible to say it that way. But Terman found a way of kind of abbreviating this all and in fact, in doing so, making it very easy to compare individuals' intelligence, even if they weren't the same age, right? So he would do this. He would say, okay, from Binet's IQ test, we can get an idea of their age as we measure. What are they capable of doing? So where are they functioning? And so that might be, say, functioning like a 12-year-old. Somebody is functioning at the level of a 12-year-old, just like we just discussed. But then you say, but how old are they really? What's their chronological age? And this might be 9. And so if we had a 12-year-old functioning, if we have a 9-year-old, that's the chronological age, functioning at the level of a 12-year-old, 12 over 9 is 1.33 repeating. Yep. Had to check that. And if we multiply that by 100, that would be 133.3 repeating. And so that child we could say they have an IQ of 133. Okay, so Binet did not invent the IQ test per se. He invented the test, but Terman was the one that kind of found a way to turn this into this intelligence quotient, the IQ. And that made it really nice, because then you could kind of compare a 10-year-old to a 6-year-old, because it's kind of saying, well, yeah, but the 10-year-old has an IQ of 120 and the 6-year-old has an IQ of 105. They're both being compared to their age group. But now you can get a sense of, both of these guys are kind of, they're doing better than their age group. And you can get a sense. So by sort of, well, and this is an important thing too. Let me mention this other part of the Terman twist. To really be able to compare people, you have to have some sense of what's normal at a given age. What do you expect people to have? And so we will literally talk about norming some measure, finding out what is normal. And Terman did a lot of norming of the IQ tests as well. He had access to the military, as described in the textbook. You can get all the details there. And so he was able to measure a lot of people on these IQ tests. And he was able to kind of get a distribution of how people perform. So if you look he's just looking at military people, and as described in the textbook, there was one test for literate military people, and there was another test for illiterate ones that couldn't read or write. So let's just focus on the literate for now. If you were able to apply this test to a whole lot of people, then you could see how they did. And one of the things he found is the distribution of scores that you see tends to be normal. Right? This is back to Galton as well. Galton originally said, hey, almost everything's normally distributed. Well, it turns out IQ is too. So if you use this equation, most people come out right around 100. In fact, 68% of people fall somewhere between 85 and 115, which is one standard deviation. A standard deviation of the IQ test is 15. I'm not going to get into all the magic, but with a little bit of psychometric magic, you can make a test have any average and any standard deviation you want. So that's another story, but just suffice it to say that as they created the intelligence test, they created it so that if you put it through this IQ formula, the average would be 100 and the standard deviation would be 15. And so that's what you see here. And that means that 68% of people are right around that 100. If we measured your IQ now, well, I was going to say you'd probably be in there, but you're not an average person. You're a university student. You're not even an average university student. You're a University of Toronto university student. We have higher standards. So your IQ, we would probably expect on average to be somewhere over here. And therefore you guys could be somewhere in this range, probably. But this is the population average. If we just measured the average population, it would be 100, have a standard deviation of 15. And again, once you know this, now you can really compare, one person has 135, somebody else has 120. You can get a sense of where they are and how much less likely it is to be at 135 than it is to be at 120, which is actually still, relatively common. And so this is what Terman really added, is a way of us all being able to understand IQs and compare them in this powerful way, given his norming and giving his IQ formula. Okay, so an important addition to the IQ, the intelligence story. All right, so let's get back to the political, because I think this is really interesting. It's fascinating. I still, from when I went to do my graduate work at University of Waterloo and met my supervisor, one of the first things he said is, well, you're going to TA my intro psychology class and you must attend every class. And so I attended every class, and I still remember that class where he said there are some things psychology should never study. And this was at a time that was it'll relate to what I'm going to show you over here. There's a guy named Philip Rushton, a psychology professor at University of Western Ontario, who had just published a book. This isn't his book, but it's a similar one. It's same kind of idea, where in Rushton's work, he was comparing different races in terms of their intellectual abilities and their sort of sexual abilities, I guess you'd say, or orientation. So he was kind of suggesting that, there's two ways in which a given group of peoples can be successful. They can use their mind and succeed by doing things in a very intelligent way, or they can have a heck of a lot of children, and even if some of those children don't survive, if you produce enough, then you have a good chance of continuing the legacy of your group, so to speak. And he was suggesting that some races favored an intellectual approach and some races favored a more sexual approach. Okay, let me just say it to you, because it may annoy you, and if it does, fantastic. Essentially what he said is he took three groups, Asians, Caucasians, and African Americans, and he put them on these two continuum. And what he basically said is, when it comes to intellectual prowess, Asians are number one, Caucasians are in the middle, African Americans are third. When it comes to sexual prowess, African Americans are number one, Caucasians in the middle yet again, Asians are third. And so, almost whoever you are, you're offended by something by what I just said. And so a lot of people were offended by Rushton. And in fact, a lot of scientists were offended by his research. They felt he had been very selective in what he described and that it wasn't good science. So it led to a big kerfuffle for a long time while I was a graduate student. And in fact, to the point where Philip Rushton apparently had to go into his office and close the door, and students were banging on his door all day and writing stuff all over it and defacing his whole office and everything, and they wanted him fired. The students were up in arms. That's how political this can be. This all culminated in a debate, a relatively famous debate between Philip Rushton and David Suzuki, of course, an adored Canadian science figure. So he's sort of a media figure in Canada. If you don't know David Suzuki, he's not in the press as much as he was, 20 years ago when I was younger. At that time, from about, I would say 30 years ago to maybe 10 years ago, he was the science person in Canada that we went to for knowledge about science stuff, and he had a show on very regularly. So anyway, Suzuki takes on Rushton in a debate, and it's very worth watching. It will show you how psychology can become very political. I've hyperlinked this for you. We're not going to watch it here, but when you download the slides, if you just click on this will fire this up, and you will... Well, you'll get an ad. Of course, you'll get an ad. But you get the idea. You'll see the debate, and it's over an hour long. So it's just, if you're in a bored COVID state and you want to watch two intellectuals argue about racial differences, I've got you covered. This is your entertainment. But it is very interesting, and it's a cool thing to check out. So I'm going to leave you with that. That's the intelligence lecture. I'm going to come back with the business one, and then I'm going to come back with the comparative psychology one. Cool. Later, guys.